celebrate World Environment Day, we're very happy to invite a guest from one of our Think Sustainable Europe platform member organizations to discuss some of the policy solutions needed to safeguard our environment. The theme for World Environment Day this year is ecosystem restoration. So we're bringing on a biodiversity expert, Dr. Ioli Christopoulou, to learn more about what European member states are and should be doing to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Ioli is a partner and policy director at the Green Tank, an independent Greek environmental think tank developing policy solutions for a sustainable future. Ioli has a background in international relations, environmental policy, and governance. Throughout her career, she has focused on sustainability and environmental issues, supporting and promoting evidence-based and transformative environmental policy, the effectiveness of protected areas, and the improvement of biodiversity conservation. She worked at WWF Greece as a policy researcher and later as their nature policy officer before co-founding the Green Tank in 2018. She has also been appointed as an NGO representative in the National Nature Committee, where she currently serves as its vice chair. She has served on the board of the Mediterranean Association to Save the Sea Turtle and teaches at the College Year in Athens. Hi, Ioli. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Julia.
Let's jump into our first question. 2020 was the super year for biodiversity. Despite COVID posing some hurdles and delaying action, the pandemic has increased awareness of our fragile relationship with nature and for the need for transformative change. Your recent work assessing the first action plan to implement Greece's strategy for biodiversity shows some challenges still remain in achieving targets and making biodiversity a priority. And it also presents recommendations to overcome these. So could you please give us a brief overview of the main opportunities you identified for Greece to deliver on its biodiversity ambitions? Perhaps if you could highlighting your top 3 recommendations.
Yes, happily. And I think it is important to keep in mind the global context as you introduced, as in 2020, despite or perhaps also due to the COVID pandemic, we saw this growing momentum on biodiversity conservation with the new EU biodiversity strategy and listening to the UN Secretary General speaking of humanity waging a war against nature. So this is the global context in which our assessment was completed and to which we would like Greece to be a part of as it develops its next biodiversity action. So you say 3 recommendations. Our first recommendation is for Greece to implement existing nature commitments through specific and measurable attainable actions. We don't need another long list of all the possible actions that relate to nature conservation. We need to see in the next few years measurable progress, in particular in relation to the country's protected areas and the conservation of specific species. The second recommendation would be to maybe go a little bit further and to align Greece with the evolving nature agenda. So perhaps to focus on new threats, such as invasive alien species, and adopting new conservation approaches, for example, for genetic biodiversity conservation on micro scale, or trying to link the landscape with nature conservation at macro scale. Nature restoration should also be a priority in the coming years. Perhaps the third and last recommendation is a bit more overarching. It involves the concept of biodiversity mainstreaming and the need to ensure that various sectors integrate nature. This, I would say, primarily applies to the tourism sector, the agriculture sector, but of course it goes beyond that.
Thank you. Yeah, those are all very important recommendations. And you mentioned protected areas. Greece has designated a protected status to more than 35% of its land area and 19% of its waters. So that exceeds the target set for 2020. But do any challenges still remain for area-based conservation in Greece?
Indeed, as you said, Greece has designated more than a third of its land territory. A portion of that is also designated as a Natura 2000 site, so as a part of the EU network of protected areas. I would say that this is partially meeting the global targets. Why do I say partially? Because as we know, it's not only about designating protected areas, but we also need to ensure effective management. And according to Greece's own last assessment of progress, as it reports it to the UN system, only 4% of the country's land and only 2% of the country's waters are under effective management. And this was interesting because I was looking these numbers again, and it's up from 1% that it was when we completed our assessment. So some progress made, but definitely many open issues remain. Interestingly, just in last December, so December 2020, the European Court of Justice ruled against Greece because it had not completed the designation of Natura 2000 sites as it should. It has not set conservation objectives, and only a few sites have management plans. There is some progress. EU funds are supporting projects to complete the designation of protected areas. Several delays, though, make this a bit difficult. And at the same time, we have a new governance system for the protected areas now in place. It's only a year that the new system was adopted, without ever before being fully operational, the previous one. So we are in a transition phase. And the new Natural Environment and Climate Change Agency, which will be taking on the management role of the country's protected area system, must become quickly fully operational. And this does not mean only having the staff and the resources, but also the processes. So, for example, to ensure participatory management in the protected area. So to wrap it up, yes, a large percentage of the country's territory has been designated as protected, but many challenges remain. Complete legal designation is necessary, and to ensure a full operational management scheme for the protected areas.
Thank you. There's also a lot of opportunities in management in protected areas, and also, as you say in your assessment, to make sure that actions that promote protected areas also deliver for sustainable development. Could you elaborate a bit on this? What opportunities do you see for creating synergies between nature protection and the sustainable development goals?
Yes. Greece's nature deserves a high level of protection, and this must be a priority. If this is secured, then it can offer also various sustainable development opportunities. And there's often this myth that protected areas are only absolute, strict reserve sites. Maybe a few of those will be needed, but this is the direction also by the new EU Biodiversity strategy. But most of the sites in Greece will require a regulation of human activities, a management of human activity, not just avoiding or prohibiting activities. At scale, appropriately assessed, this can offer local sustainable development opportunities. This is closely linked to the idea of biodiversity integration and mainstreaming across sectors. We're thinking here of giving incentives for sustainable farming within protected areas that can also help meet biodiversity targets, or tourism activities that will integrate nature conservation. And if you think about it, Greece has the potential to develop a new branding identity. We would call it Nature Greece. Imagine a platform created for the country's protected areas, offering visitors information to go to an area, to enjoy various activities, and then be able to buy local products with a label Nature Greece, feeling that they contribute to biodiversity conservation. This idea will generate local income, will support local products, offering opportunities for Greece's exports, as well as various alternative tourism packages so that we can have tourists all around the year rather than only the summer.
I love that idea of the Nature Greece rebranding. Then when you're trying to mainstream biodiversity conservation in all areas of society, it's also very important to recognize the national and political context in which this is happening. So when the Biodiversity Action Plan was adopted, Greece was facing an important economic crisis. So I was wondering, how did this affect the implementation of the plan? And do you think there's any parallels or lessons that can be learned now that countries are facing another crisis, COVID?
It's interesting that you point this out. I think it was more than a decade that the Greek biodiversity strategy was being prepared before being approved, one of the peak years of the financial crisis in 2014. And interestingly, I think the momentum from the Aichi targets being adopted and the 2020 EU biodiversity strategy was influential. But the crisis had an impact, may have led to several of the delays that we noticed in its implementation, to understaffed public services, to several gaps in the progress. Throughout the crisis, the environment was not given the priority that it should. And I think this is where the differences start with the COVID crisis. The momentum is different. The pandemic helped us realize that, as you mentioned earlier already, transformative change is needed and the recovery must be green. So as Greece develops its new biodiversity action plan, I think it has the potential to be implemented more effectively because of the change context. And in this sense, also support the mainstreaming of biodiversity across policies, which was missing before.
Great. So to dig a bit deeper into what you mentioned on the recovery plan, is Greece taking any steps to strengthen and mainstream the consideration of biodiversity across its policies in its COVID recovery?
Greece is one of the countries that submitted already its recovery plans. I think it was the second country to submit its recovery plan. It claims to offer the foundations for a green biodiversity. I say this because even though we've seen an overview of the actions, we have not seen all the details. These have not been public. So it's a bit difficult to accept the claim without having seen the documentation and the substantive documentation for this claim. There are actions foreseen for biodiversity conservation, but I have to say that I'm afraid that many of them are still considered as sectoral measures, so taken on by the Ministry of Environment or this new agency that will be taking on the management of protected areas rather than being cross-cutting across sectors. And this is why we recommend that the new Biodiversity Action Plan must be speedily adopted to guide this process, as well as the use of the funds from the 2021-2027 EU budget, particularly the cohesion funds and the Common Agricultural Policy funds. And the new Biodiversity Action Plan, unlike the previous one, going back to your previous question, should not be just adopted by the Ministry of Environment, but actually be adopted across ministers as a guiding policy for the future, for the next decade for Greece.
Thank you very much. Let's hope that some of these recommendations are taken on board for the new biodiversity plan. And thank you again for joining us, Ioli. It was a pleasure to chat to you and to learn more about what Greece and the Green Tank are doing for biodiversity.
Thank you so much for having me.